So what's the best exercise for these muscles, which will then help us understand how we then go about training them? Well, before I go into that, I just want to mention I'm leaving sources down in the description below, which will, again, provide further information on top of what I'm saying. Again, if you have any questions about any of that, again, stick them in the comments below. If you're enjoying the information so far, hit the like button and also hit the subscribe button and the bell icon as well. So how do we best what's the best exercise for these muscles? Well, that basically lies in understanding the function, which we've kind of already talked about so far. So let's delve a little bit more into the anatomy of these muscles. So we've talked about where they are. They're close to the spine and they're very small muscles. So with regards to that, they don't have a lot of force and they don't have a large range of movement. So because they don't have a lot of force, they aren't able to sort of perform heavy movements, if you will, or lift heavy weights, if that makes sense. Because they don't have a great range of movement, they aren't able to do gross movement. Another part of their anatomy is muscle spindles. Now, muscle spindles detect length of muscles, or length changes in muscles, I should say, because they'll detect when muscle gets longer, and they'll detect when muscles get shorter. Now, if you can imagine, muscles are made up of many, many thousands of what are known as muscle fibers, and they're just like long cords, if you will. And then you've got muscle spindles that wrap around them, literally like a spring. So if you take a spring and you can sort of make it longer and then it goes back to the way it came. And if you turn and look down the end, what you'll see is basically a hole that runs all the way through and down. That's where the muscle fiber sits. And the muscle spindle basically sits around it like a coiled spring. And then as the muscle gets longer, these coils separate. So it detects the length, the distance between them. When it shortens, obviously the coils get closer together and it detects that. So it will detect rotation, it will detect flexion, it will detect extension, it will detect flexion and rotation, it will detect extension and rotation in either and all directions. So we've got these high density muscle spindles, or high density of muscle spindles. So that starts to tell us it's more about spinal stability and it's more about spinal coordination, because it's trying to read where the vertebrae are and where the processes are and what they're doing. Are they close together? So if one gets closer together, the other should be getting far away, and vice versa. As we go into like a lateral flexion, when we go into a rotation, they should pick up where the vertebrae are going. So the primary function is providing feedback to the central nervous system, not movement. Movement is a secondary and a tertiary sort of function of them. Primarily, they are there to detect changes in length and the position of the spine. So that's kind of the first thing that we need to understand, because if they aren't movement muscles, we don't train them with a back extension. It's not a useful exercise to train better stability. The second thing is they have minimal contribution to spinal extension. So again, when we talk about back extension, we go either, if we're led on the floor, we go from what is essentially a neutral spine into an extended spine. So they don't play a great role within that. That will be down to longissimus and iliocostalis. And again, that's not even their primary role, but they have the ability to do it. The third one is they are basically performing fine-tuned postural control to help maintain segmental stability. So if they notice two vertebrae are rotating too much, they will have a bit of fine control there, and they will do that resisted flexion because they're noticing they're going a bit too far. So it will start to hold the spine to bring stability to that segment, to those two vertebrae. So by training it with back extensions, you're not training their function. In some respects, you're sort of counteracting their function, if that makes sense. Because what you want to be able to do is, with regards to postural control, is, so I guess number one, what you want the torso to be able to do is maintain posture. So that's sort of number one, maintain posture. Number two is resist movement. So by resisting movement is we choose exercises that have inbuilt instability within them. And we maintain posture throughout that. Because that's doing the fine-tuned postural control. That's using the high density of muscle spindles. And we aren't really going through large ranges of movement, which, again, aren't that useful to them. And it certainly doesn't work a lot through that sort of contraction phase, or they're not contributing through their contraction phase. They will lengthen and contract, but again, as I mentioned, that is not their primary function. So trying to train the primary function of flexion into extension is not training those muscles. So if you are being told you need to do, let's just say, a back extension to get the deeper sort of muscles of the spine, that is essentially incorrect. That's not what you're doing. And that's what the four studies will sort of talk you through in the description below. So the first one by Bogduk discusses the high density of muscle spindles in the deep spinal muscles and their role in proprioception and segmental control. Then the next one by McGill explains the function of the intrinsic spinal muscles, including interspinalis, in maintaining posture and providing proprioceptive feedback. Kendall describes the interspinalis as having a greater role in stability and proprioception rather than force production. And then Schlipp discusses how small spinal muscles rich in sensory receptors are key for spinal control rather than primary movement. So it's very important that we understand this type of information, because until a coach, trainer, therapist understand this, they won't understand the type of exercise to be providing you with. So what we want to be able to do is use exercises that are stability based, that have instability inherently within the exercise. So in very broad terms and very crude terms, balance type exercises. Now, that's not the most ideal, but it will give you an idea. It's something that will try and offset your posture. That's the type of exercise. Now, these are a little bit harder to describe because they aren't the mainstream. They aren't bicep curls. They aren't bench press. They aren't back extension. They aren't sit-ups. It's not those types of exercises. And what we'll try and do in the next part is we'll try and talk more about those exercises, but it's going to be a little bit harder to do because the description of them you may not recognise in a format like this. If I was in a gym, it may be a little bit easier, but that will be for another tutorial. This is trying to give you the underlying information, and what I'll do in a further tutorial is actually show you exercises. But for now, let's go into part number 3, which is talking about how we go about training them.